Welcome to the Section 2 lecture for Chapter 25. And in this chapter, we're going to be going over the social developments. So on your SPICE chart, you're going to want to take notes on Latin America and North America um, in different columns. So like you're continuing the same SPICE chart basically, right? So now we're going to be looking at the social developments. So we're going to try to explain two changes in social structures that you're going to see. Okay, so you want to try to answer the questions that are there. And we're looking at colonial society in section 2. So once the conquest is finished, what we see emerging in Latin America is the formation of multicultural societies. Latin America had, like I mentioned in the previous lecture, they had a large population of indigenous people. So even after the smallpox plague decimates the population, there's still a significant number of indigenous people. And Spain, they call them indios, right? They call them the Indians. And the Europeans were the ones that then became the dominant group within society. Spain sets up what is called a caste system. And this picture you see here with the different families, the color picture, that's an example of a caste card. So what the Spaniards did was they named your mix, and according to how much European blood you had, that determined your role in the social hierarchy. So at the very top were the Españoles. At the very top were the Españoles, and if you were born on the Spanish Peninsula, you were called a peninsular. So if you were born in Spain, you came from the peninsula, the Iberian Peninsula, you can hold the highest positions in government. And only viceroys, only peninsulares could be viceroys. So in order to reach the highest levels, you had to have come from Spain. If you were a European born in the colony, you were called a criollo. So criollos were Europeans born in Mexico or in Peru. Then you had if a Spanish man had a baby with an Indian woman, they were called a mestizo. And then if a mestizo had a child with a European, with the Española, they would call him a castizo, right? If a mestiza and an Español, they would call him a morisco, right? So they had different mixes for the different types of racial mixes. And then to cultivate the sugar, they also brought African slaves. So then you also had people that were mixed with African slaves. So you had, they were called sometimes moros. Jarocho was if you were mixed Indian and African, because most of the Africans that mixed with natives or mestizos. Not a lot of them mixed with Europeans, but there was. And so if you were white and African, you were a mulatto. But if you were Indian and African, then you were a jarocho. And then if you were a jarocho and a mestizo, right, for every possible name, they had like 20 something different labels. And this is a way of dividing people. This is a way, divide and conquer. You treat the people that have more European blood better, they're going to help you maintain this unfair system because they're benefiting more than everyone else. Even though they're not at the top, they're not as bad off as the people at the bottom. And at the very, very bottom of the social order were the indios, the natives who did not want to convert, who did not mix. They were seen as the social outcasts within this multicultural system. Okay, so that's the way the Spanish caste system was set up. In North America, you didn't have as much mixing going on. There were some examples. The French settlers in Canada who did mix with indigenous people developed métis, which is like the French word for mestizo. But women were more numerous among the French and English migrants. So initially, the people who came from Spain and Portugal came to get rich. They left their families in Spain. Um, they came to get rich, and they came to build wealth and then take it back. And so they would live here for some years. And even if they didn't, they had their families back home that they would send money to, but then they would have families here. That's another practice that is seen in Latin America even today, of men who keep two families. Even though they're married, they have another family going on at the same time. Not this is my ex and now this is my new family, but simultaneous families going on. That's a cultural practice that was instituted by these early Spanish settlers. That machismo. Okay, so you know, Native society was not as patriarchal as the Spanish society, but this concept of machismo is something that is introduced in Latin America by Spain. So in the North American societies, since people were more likely to come as families, there was not as much mixing that went on. So mingling between people of different ancestry was not as common in the colonies in North America. Although it did happen, right? It didn't happen as often. So even the even the Spanish, I mean, even the English settlers who interacted with the natives, right? They traded with them, but they didn't necessarily live with them. They didn't have the same kind of relationships that you saw happening in Latin America. So what you want to be able to do for the next slides is be able to explain two changes in the social structures that take place, right, because of colonization. Another significant development, and you could talk about this economically, so we're now looking at the E, is going to take place in the economy, and that's the development of mining. The Spaniards find silver. They're looking for gold, but what they ended up finding more significant than gold was silver. When they find the mine in Potosi, which is up in the Andes Mountains, they find it's so rich this mountain still has silver. It's been mined for over 400 years and it's still producing silver. And they shortly, after this discovery, they discovered a way to make it easier to mine the silver. So pretty soon, silver mining became a very big economic activity in South America at the mines in Potosi, and then also around Zacatecas. So silver was by far more important than gold because there is more of it, right? So even though gold is more valuable, it's very limited in quantity on the planet. Silver is much more abundant. It's easier to find, and so they could use it for its value for coinage. In order to mine Potosi, the Spaniards had to implement a labor system. And what they did was they adopted the mita system, the system that the Inca used to use by requiring people to build roads and bridges. And we talked about this before. The Spaniards use that system, only now they're forcing them to go work in the mines of Potosi, which is a lot more dangerous than building a wall or a bridge or a road. So using the mita system, they begin to mine Potosi, and then they begin to pack this silver and they begin to coin it. They begin to turn it into coin. They send this coin to Acapulco where it's going to be shipped. And so silver is going to have a big global significance that you should be aware of. If you take a look at this symbol on the coin, the pillar on the right hand side of that coin or that crown, if you look closely, you can see where our symbol for the dollar sign comes from. You can see kind of that little ribbon that's wrapped around. That's where our dollar symbol comes from. And even our word dollar comes from the silver currencies that the Spanish used. So this is known as a piece of 8. And so they had these coins that are going to revolutionize commerce in the Indian Ocean. So silver becomes very significant because at the same time all this is happening in the Americas, China under the Qing dynasty and actually yeah, under the Qing dynasty, they're beginning to close off their markets. They don't like all this growth in commerce, how it's changed Chinese society. They don't like how all these foreign ideas have entered China dating back to the Mongols. And so they're trying to focus on rebuilding Chinese culture. So they shut off to the rest of the world and they're only trading at particular posts. But Chinese goods are still in high demand. And so people want Chinese goods, but China doesn't want their goods. China says, we're pretty self sufficient. We have everything we need here. We don't need from you. So if you wanted anything, you had to get it in silver. Because what China also begins to do within China is they begin to collect taxes in silver. So the people had to pay their taxes in silver. They need to get silver from somewhere else. And prior to that, most of the silver came from Japan. So you can see this chart. This was from a previous AP exam. And who knows, maybe it'll appear on one of your tests later on this unit. Hint, hint. So the top chart shows these, routes of how much, tons of silver are flowing. And from the top one, you could see that Japan is exporting 59 tons of silver, mostly to East Asia. If you look at the bottom chart, Japan is not importing any. Because prior to the finding of the mines in Potosi, Japan was the main source of the world's silver. But it really only holds about 10% compared to what was found in Latin America. So once Latin America's silver currency begins to be coined, it becomes the main commodity. All the merchants want it. And so ships would carry silver from Acapulco to Manila on the Manila galleons in order to be then used to purchase goods to be sent to Europe. And so it's going to lead to price revolutions in the Indian Ocean. It's going to have an impact on China because China is going to begin to hoard a lot of silver. In the Caribbean, people who can't access Spanish silver are waiting for Spanish ships to reach open waters and attack them through piracy. So make sure you understand that, okay, why silver becomes so important. So another development besides mining, the main occupation was farming, or raising stock, animals, craft production. But mining was used more for the currency. In order to live in the colony, you needed to produce goods, you needed to produce food. And that's where the hacienda system comes in. So the hacienda is a plantation system. And these are haciendas. And actually that blue one is a hotel that I've actually stayed in the Yucatan Peninsula. So some old haciendas have been remade today into kind of like bed and breakfast hotels. So an hacienda is a plantation. The owner lives in the house, owns this huge tract of land. The native people work on the land, right? In the plantation, you have like the mill. If you're growing grain, you're going to have a mill there. You're going to have, an engeno if you're doing a sugar plantation where they're milling the sugar cane. So all the production is it's kind of like an early factory, but it's not a factory. And so all the work took place on plantations, and then the hacendados would then take their product to market. So the products of the hacienda were mostly of European origin: wheat, grapes, meat from pigs and cattle, etc. But this also led to the exploitation of workers because the Spaniards owned all the land. So they implemented labor systems to meet the demand for labor. Since a lot of indigenous people had died, and a lot of them were being overworked in the encomienda system that I talked about earlier, you had other forms to meet labor. And one of them was the slave trade. So the transatlantic slave trade started to provide labor in places where there was high demand for crops, for the cultivation of crops, but not a lot of people to grow. So in the Caribbean, in parts of Mexico, in parts of the South of the United States, and in Brazil, you had, a lot of slavery. You also had indentured servitude. People in North America who wanted to come settle in the North American colonies, who wanted to start a new life but didn't have the money to make the journey, they could sell themselves into indentured servitude, which means for a period usually of about 7 years, they had to work for the landowner. And then after 7 years, they would be given their independence and usually a small tract of land to kind of start their own life. So this is kind of like a way of paying to get to the colonies and start a new life. You gave up your life for 7 years for somebody else. And that would be like me saying, hey, if you work for me for free for 5 years, I'll pay for your college and your dorm and your transportation while you go to school, right? And people are like, oh, okay, cool. And I just have to work for you for 5 years? Okay. So it's kind of that kind of system. Obviously, it's a little harsher because you're doing manual labor. But not all treatment was good. So you also see a lot of resistance to Spanish rule. So resistance was very common. People ran away from slave plantations. People revolted against their owners. There was different rebellions. There was a rebellion in Mexico City where actually African slaves rebelled and tried to take over the city. So there were different examples of resistance. There was the Pueblo revolt that your book mentions with Pope, who rebels against the missionaries trying to convert them. Even here in San Diego, the mission, if you've ever gone to San Diego mission, that's the fourth time that mission was built because there had been previous missions here in San Diego and natives had rebelled and burned one of them. And then others had flooded. So there was even a revolt here where they killed a priest at the mission. Of course, if you go to the mission, they're going to, talk about the poor priest who was killed and not the native people who were being exploited for the land. So the governments of Spain and Portugal, they tried to pass laws and decrees to reduce the abuses. They set up a court system to try to protect the Indians, but what it did was it actually contributed to the exploitation of it because it was a corrupt system. In Brazil, we see a large population of slaves because of the cultivation of sugar on the Engenos. And like I mentioned earlier, Brazil was the largest. I think it was something like, I want to say about 50% of all the slaves on the transatlantic slave trade route were destined to go to Brazil. And the reason is sugar cultivation is very labor intensive. It's not an easy job. It's very tiring. It's very exhausting. So the Europeans didn't want to do that. But sugar is very profitable. By using slave labor, they're not paying people. They're just keeping them alive to work. They overwork them. And so plantations were very brutal. Oftentimes these machines, this engeno, that what you see these two men working there, oftentimes in machines they would have a machete hanging on the side in case your arm got caught. Rather than slowing down and stopping and taking the machine apart, they just cut your arm off and keep the production going because you were seen as dispensable because they could just keep bringing slaves. This is going to have major ramifications in Africa as well, and you're going to read about those in the next chapter. So that's the bitter history of sugar, which is supposed to be sweet, right? So more than any other societies, the number of deaths was highest in Brazil, and so that kept the demand constant, and that's gonna create a moral dilemma as well. And again, your book kind of doesn't touch on this, but this is the birth of modern racism. In order to justify this brutal treatment of other human beings, especially if you're a society that is claiming to have these Christian values, how do you reconcile believing these words of the Bible of treating people a certain way, but then treating human beings in such a brutal manner? The only way to reconcile those in your mind is to convince yourself that these people somehow either deserve it or they're less human. So Africans had been interacting with Europeans for a long time without the racist connotations that go along with it. but it's during the period of transatlantic slave trade where the brutality increases that you begin to see these more racist attitudes of skin color. And it stems from that justifying your economic necessity in a way that doesn't contradict your morality. So then by seeing people as less than humans or not having souls or not being, Christian, it was a way of lifting that guilt for the European settlers. And so that's something that's going to continue into the age of imperialism. When we study imperialism, you will see that. And you can see that in the depiction of how African people are depicted in art in the 13, 14, 1500s versus in the 17, 18, 1900s. Other economic activities in the north included fur trading. So along, the French routes into Canada and into the parts of the US that were more of the plains, traders sought fur, beaver pelts, bear skins, fox. So these had high value. They were used, in luxury clothing. Depends on the type, depends on the fur. There were some furs that were very highly sought after because of their strength, their cleanliness, their softness. And so they would be traded for firearms. They would trade them for precious metals or other, pots, alcohol, and that's also going to have some effects on Native communities. So in North America, especially in Canada, this was the main economic activity. And that's why you also didn't see a lot of large settlements where people were mixing with the natives, because they were there, the fur traders were mostly men. So there's not a lot of settlement. And then in other places, tobacco and other cash crops also begin to be grown. So in North America, we're also going to see the growth of these cash crops in the South, where the weather is more suitable for the growing of tobacco and for the growing of sugar, and then later on cotton. So plantations in the South are also going to create a demand for cheap labor, and colonists in North America, like the ones in Portugal and in Spain, or in the Portuguese and Spanish colonies, are going to displace indigenous people with African labor and with indentured servitude. So, but the African labor in the United States is only about 5%. So when we talk about the slave trade, only 5% of the slave trades were destined for what is the United States. Most were in the Caribbean and in Brazil. So you should be able to explain the economy. And then lastly, so you have the economic motives and the changes in labor systems that you should be able to discuss by now. And the last thing we're going to talk about is going to be is religion, and that's Christianity. So that's something else that's different. In Latin America, you see a much more intentional effort to Christianize the native populations. Because you're settling large areas with a lot of people, they're going to start building a lot of churches. In Mexico City and in the surrounding areas around Mexico City, where the most indigenous people lived, you could see even today hundreds of churches dating back to the 16th and 17th centuries, because where there was large centers of people, they would build churches to service them. And so the conversion of the native populations was brought by missionaries. So Spanish missionaries from mostly the Franciscan and the Dominican orders are the ones who came to the Americas. So in the Caribbean, you see the Dominican orders. In Mexico, you see mostly the Franciscans, and in some parts the Jesuits as well. So they came here to Christianize the natives. So following the conquest, and often they would often conflict with the hacendados, with the encomenderos. They would have conflicts with the other settlers because of how they were treating the natives. So sometimes the priests were looking out for the well treatment of the natives. Not always. They also had their abuses. Okay, but they came to convert. And one of the tools they used to convert in Mexico was the Virgen de Guadalupe, because the native people didn't want to convert. But with the Virgen de Guadalupe and the story of an Aztec speaking apparition of the Virgin Mary, they were able to blend the indigenous elements of worshiping Mother Earth by giving them a image of a Christian symbol, but with an indigenous look. And so that made it faster for people to accept Christianity, because there was a lot of resistance. People converted by name only early on, because if they didn't convert, they were punished brutally by the conquistadores. So oftentimes natives would take their religion underground, not literally under the ground, right? But they would take it and they would hide it within Christianity. So when they were doing the sign of the cross, they're really thinking of these four directions. When they would pray to the goddess, right, their Mother Earth, they would do it in front of a virgin, right? So the Spaniards think, okay, they're praying to the Virgin Mary, where the natives are like, we're doing a ritual to Mother Earth. So that's why you see a lot of saints in Mexico, the cult of saints. And in Mexico, there's a saint for everything, right? There's probably a saint you're praying to right now, hoping that this presentation ends soon. So this is part of how the natives adopted Christianity, because they had different deities, right? You heard of Tlaloc and Huitzilopochtli, right? Tonatiuh, right? The sun, the water, the wind. So these deities were then translated into saints. The Spaniards kind of put Christian symbols at these different temples. And so they started worshiping them as saints. And that's something that exists in Latin America, and that's kind of unique in the parts of Latin America that had high indigenous people. And then they built missions to bring lands under cultivation. And that picture of that mission, that's here. That's Mission San Diego. That's where we get our name from a Franciscan mission in the 1700s that was built here in Mission Valley, right, where the San Diego Padres used to play baseball. Padres look like this padre right here, this friar. By the way, this is right off the Friars Road exit. So, and then the English and French missionaries were not as successful because they weren't interacting with heavily settled populations, and they weren't really trying to convert them. They brought Christianity here for themselves, but they weren't trying to make the native people around them Christian. They invited them to it. They did preach to them, but they didn't like take it as seriously as the Spaniards and the Portuguese did, where they would punish you if you didn't accept their religion. But religion spread because they came in high numbers, and as the population grew, they built more churches, and pretty soon, people began to teach Christianity to the surrounding people. So that's going to be another change that takes place. So that is it for this lecture, and because we're going to be focusing on an essay this week, I'm not going to give you the lecture for section 3 since it's on Australia and the Pacific Islands. But if you have any questions, we can go over that in class on Friday. But we're going to be focusing on writing an essay, so we're going to focus on these two sections. So that's it for the lectures for this week, okay? I'll see you in class.